All right. So we've hit the New Testament. The church, we're coming into the church time anyway, the period that's really shaped history for the last 2,000 years. And it all begins in the strangest way. So the theological terms, probably most of you have heard before, for God becoming a human is in the Incarnation. That's the term that's used. And obviously, Jesus existed eternally. In the book of John, it begins with, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And so that the Word is Jesus. So Jesus existed from the very beginning, and then it goes on to say, all things were created by him, by the Word. So in that beginning passage in Genesis, where it said, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, God said, let there be light. That's Jesus. That's my interpretation, at least, putting John and Genesis together. And of course, Jesus appeared to people in the Old Testament, potentially. But he didn't become human until 6 BC, when he was born. And that's a huge mystery. How is that possible? How could God be human? How could he once not have been a human but became a human? So the Incarnation makes no sense from human understanding. And maybe one day it'll make sense to us in heaven. But it's not going to make sense to us on this side of the grave. And the term that's often used in theology for these things that God has revealed to us, but that we just cannot understand, the term that's often used is mystery. And so there are a number of mysteries in the Bible. And when the term mystery is used, it normally doesn't mean something that we don't know. It's something that God has revealed that we couldn't figure out on our own and we can't understand on our own. And there's a degree of faith that's required to accept these mysteries. And this is probably one of the biggest mysteries in Christianity. And it changed the world, of course, Jesus becoming man, the Incarnation.
Mm.
And so tonight we're going to look at how Malcolm's done a fantastic job summarising it all, summarising the Gospels up to Palm Sunday, the beginning of the Holy Week. So with that in mind, let's pray. Simon, do you want to pray?
So, as Graham said, we're looking at the Gospels and what we call Jesus' ministry. So Jesus' birth and ministry. And so let's start with, what is a gospel? Gospel is an Old English word that means good news, and it translates the Greek word that means the same thing, good news, which is euangelion, which is where we get evangelism from. So evangelism is sharing the good news. The gospel, that's what gospel means in general, but the Gospels, the 4 books that talk about Jesus' lives, what are they? Well, they have a particular genre, a particular category of literature that they belong to, and that is ancient biography. Ancient biographies are a lot like modern biographies. They present a factual account of an individual's life. So their focus is on presenting facts about the individual, not fantasies, not stories. And biographies focus on particular aspects of an individual's life, whatever they think is important. And the 4 different Gospels actually focus on slightly different aspects of Jesus' life, although the Passion, which we're not looking at, is the major focus of all of them. And so it's really in the Jesus ministry that the variation is more notable. And a biographer generally feels free to rearrange things a little bit, even the order of things. Like when I'm telling you a story, even if it's a factual story about what happened to me last week or whatever, I might put things out of chronological order, and you don't go, you're just making it up. So the same's true with the Gospels. And the Gospels are basically taking input from oral sources. So what people who walked with Jesus have said about Jesus. Now, some of the Gospels are written by people who walked with Jesus, but they're still being reminded by other Christians who walk with Jesus of things that Jesus said and did. So all of the Gospels take from more than one person's perspective, and they're not written as they go along, as Jesus goes along. And they were written for the purpose of the Gospels was for the church, for the benefit of the church, and their primary purpose was to present Jesus as the Son of God, as Messiah. And that's why they're so big on his death and resurrection. So why are there 4 of them and not just one? Why don't we just have one official gospel? Why do we have 4? Well, the reason is because these different perspectives give us a fuller picture. And so people actually valued the different gospels because they gave them a bigger picture, a more complete picture. Also, there's 4 because they're genuine witness statements. And so 4 of the people who had access to these witness statements, either because they were witnesses or because they went and talked to witnesses or heard from witnesses, decided to write it down. And that was a legit reason. And people went, well, that's fair enough. They're what we call apostolic testimony. So they have the testimony of the apostles, the people who walked with Jesus, who were taught by Jesus. And the Gospels appear, they become necessary and they're written by the time that the church transitions from what's called the rule of faith, which is the body of teaching that people collected from Jesus and then handed on to new Christians. But as those people start to get old and die out, we no longer have those first-person testimonies directly accessible to us. So we've never had that, right? We live 2,000 years later. So how do you preserve that? The Gospels are part of the answer. And so the Gospels became more important. It was more important to write this stuff down as you got further away and as the witnesses started to be killed or to die naturally. And you have 4 as well because they meet differing needs of the church. Each of the Gospels have a slightly different audience, different parts of the church, and also different roles of the church, different things that are important to the church. Now, you may be wondering what this weird picture over here is with these indecipherable things on it with wings. This is from the Book of Kells, which is a very famous illuminated manuscript from Iona in Scotland that was copied out in 800 AD, and we still have it. I think it's in. Is it in Ireland? In Dublin, in the Dublin University Library or something.
My parents saw it.
I think
that one they could tell. They looked at it. I think in Ireland. Yes.
Yeah, I think it's in Dublin Uni Library. I think I saw it too. I certainly saw some amazing manuscript there. And this represents the 4 Gospels, and they actually each have a symbol that the church gave them in antiquity. In the first, probably in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries. And these creatures are actually taken from Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 10. They're the winged creatures around the throne of God. The first one is a man or an angel, a winged man, and that represents Matthew. The second one here is a lion, believe it or not, and that represents Mark. The third one here is an ox, and that represents Luke. And the 4th one is an eagle, and that represents John. And I'll talk a little bit about how these symbols actually have some meaning when we talk about the differences between the Gospels. The Gospels are definitely different, but they're also similar. And this diagram here, these bars here, you can see they go up to 60%. The black ones, the tallest black one. These are bars representing the verbal agreement between the Gospels. 3 of the Gospels have a lot in common. I'm about to tell you how we talk about that. But what they most especially have in common, these black bars, which are taller, are the words of Jesus. So the people heard Jesus' words and they remembered them. And so when they wrote them down, they had more agreement about that than about anything else. So we'll talk a bit more about how the Gospels work together in a moment. But before we do that, who are the authors? Now, all four of the Gospels are anonymous. We're going to talk about these things called Gnostic Gospels or apocalyptic Gospels or hidden Gospels. And the ironic thing is that all of those Gospels aren't anonymous. They claim to be from a particular author, but they were written after that author was dead. So they're making it up. Whereas these genuine Gospels don't make any claims about who wrote them at all. Fortunately, we have some clues and also tradition. So the tradition says that Luke was written by Luke, the companion of Paul. And when we look at Luke, you can see that it's clearly a part of Luke and Acts. Luke and Acts form one whole. And when we read Acts, we see that the narrator suddenly changes into the first person when Dr. Luke is accompanying Paul. And so that's a very strong indication that this two-part book is written by Luke, who's a Gentile, a Greek. And so he's a companion of an apostle, not an apostle himself. So when we talk about apostolic stuff, it's somebody who's very close to an apostle counts as well. John in the gospel that we call John, and the tradition says that it was written by John. And in the gospel, John is represented as the beloved disciple. We know that it's John that's called the beloved disciple because of how it fits in with the other gospels. And that's John, the brother of James and the son of Zebedee, one of the three closest people to Jesus. And so that confirms the authorship of John. It doesn't prove it, but it fits in with it. The gospel, according to Mark, which tradition tells us is written by John Mark, the person who went with Barnabas and Paul on their first mission and who left. And Paul got grumpy with, but eventually ends up considering one of his closest friends. So John Mark also is associate of apostles, but tradition tells us that John Mark actually was very close to Peter as well. And when Peter went to Rome, he preached a lot, and Mark wrote his gospel from Peter's preaching. And a confirmation of that, or a correlation with that, is the way that the Gospel of Mark has a very harsh representation of Peter. Peter's a bit of a loser in Mark, and that sort of sounds like Peter, being humble sort of thing when he's sharing his story. And Matthew, we just have to rely on tradition, which tells us that the Apostle Matthew, who was the tax collector that Jesus called, is the author of this gospel. Interestingly, Matthew is the only gospel that calls Levi Matthew. So that's something that I noticed this morning. So that's how we know Matthew's name is Matthew. And the tradition that we rely on is very, very early, very consistent. So there's not a lot of debate. People aren't going, I wonder who wrote this book. By the end of the 2nd century, everyone was pretty sure who wrote these books. And this picture here, this is a diagram. You can see the man with the wings again representing Matthew. So this is Matthew here writing out his gospel in a codex. And this person in the back here, peeking out behind the curtain, is Moses with the tablet of the law. And we'll discover why Moses is in the background there in a moment. So has anyone heard of the synoptic problem? Have any of you guys heard of the synoptic problem? Do you know what a synoptic gospel is? So synopsis means seeing together. It comes from the Greek synopsis, optic, seeing, sin together. And it's talking about how the three gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are very similar. They share a lot of material. They have a very similar structure. And the problem is, how did they get that material? How did they gather that material together? What did they share? Who shared it with? Who was the original? Where did the material come from? It's not really a problem in terms of, it's not a problem for Christianity. It's just a problem for theologians to think about. So Matthew and Luke both contain a lot of material from Mark, and they also contain their own original editions. And Matthew and Luke also share material that's not in Mark. So they have something in common with one another that Mark doesn't have. Matthew's material is in quite a different order from Mark and Luke. Matthew, for example, it collects a whole bunch of teaching together in the Sermon on the Mount. That's a very easy to see example. And all three of the synoptics, that's what we call the synoptic gospels, all three of them edit their common material. So that graph I showed you with the bars, they weren't all at 100%. So they don't copy exactly from each other. They change their material. They give it their own little spin, use their own terminology. John is totally different. It's not a synoptic gospel because it sort of forms a complement. Apart from the Passion period, and even in the Passion, John's very different. But in Jesus' ministry, John is almost completely different. It's almost as if John has said, okay, I know what these guys wrote about, so I'll write about all the other stuff that's important that they've left out. And so John's not called a synoptic gospel. So how do we solve this problem? What happened? How did they gather it? Now, this is a traditional solution. It's called the two-source hypothesis, and you'll still hear a lot of people talking about this. So if you hear about Q, it's not QAnon. It's much older than QAnon. I think, mate, did QAnon get its Q from here? The theory in this two-source hypothesis is that Mark was written first, Matthew and Luke had access to their own material, and there was another source that was around, a written source around, as well as Mark, called Q. And generally, I think it's thought of as a bunch of sayings of Jesus. And Mark wrote his stuff down, Q wrote his stuff down, Matthew grabbed his own stuff, Mark's stuff, and Q's stuff, did his gospel. Luke grabbed Mark's stuff, Q's stuff, and his stuff, and did his gospel, right? Now, the problem with this is it speculates about this Q. There's no evidence whatsoever for Q. It's a completely made up source. And it comes from this era in Christian scholarship when they wanted to put the Gospels as late as possible. So they wanted the development of the Gospels to be really complicated so that they could discount as much of them as possible. Fortunately, for many people, that era is now over, and we recognise that the Gospels were actually fairly early and their development was fairly straightforward. And so in response to that, actually, this idea has been around for a long time too, the two gospel hypothesis. And this one simplifies it down a lot. You have Matthew, he writes his gospel, and then Luke takes his own stuff plus Matthew and writes his gospel, and Mark takes Luke and Matthew and a bit of his own stuff and writes his gospel. But that one doesn't quite fit the various evidence. I won't go into the evidence, it's complicated. There's evidence from cognitive psychology, there's evidence from the text, but this one doesn't quite fit as well. So the latest popular model is the modified two gospel hypothesis for Mark and priority. So Mark has priority. It's very similar. Mark, instead of Matthew being written first, Mark was written first. And then Luke takes Mark and his own stuff. Because remember, Luke says at the beginning of his gospel that he went and talked to the people who were involved. And so that's his source. And he takes that plus Mark. And then Matthew writes a bit later. So he takes Mark and Luke and his own stuff because he's an apostle. He was there. So he has his own memories. And he creates his gospel. And Matthew moves stuff around a lot. When he picks from Mark and Luke, he puts them in different places. So a problem with these two gospel hypothesis, a big obvious problem is that Mark has to take from Matthew but use Luke's structure. So it's a bit weird. It's a bit hard to understand. It's easier to understand how because Matthew shifts everyone's stuff around. So it's a bit easier. The second one here is a bit easier to understand. Make sense? Now, is this super important? Not really, but it's helpful to understand how the Gospels probably formed because it gives us a bit more confidence in them. We're not imagining. See, one of the things, if you listen to the TV, especially around Easter time, they'll say things like, over hundreds of years, legends formed, and then the Gospels were finally, written out of these legends and all this sort of stuff. It was nothing like that. We can be 100% confident that that is not how the Gospels were written. And so now let's talk about the dates, because the dates that the Gospel were written make it impossible that they're legendary. Mark, as mentioned, is generally accepted nowadays as the first Gospel. And it was written sometime from AD 55 up to the late 60s. There's a whole bunch of reasons why we can narrow it down to that. It's evidence within Mark. It's evidence with the other literature that we have around that Mark influenced that sets those limits. So that's quite early. Remember, Jesus was crucified in AD 33. So we're talking about 22 to 37 years later. I think it's probably earlier in this, probably 55 to 60. So we're talking about 22 to 27 years after Jesus' crucifixion, which is, not very long at all. Luke is dependent on Mark in this most popular model. And of course, Luke is linked to Acts, and Acts ends around AD 62 when Paul was in prison in Rome. And so that's sort of, for most scholars, they understand that as setting a limit on how late Luke could have written Luke Acts. And so that means that Luke was written in the 60s, in the early 60s after Mark, which pushes Mark earlier, which is why I said 55 to 60. Matthew is dependent on Mark and Luke. So if Luke was written by 62, then that means that Matthew's written sometime in the 60s, a bit later. And John fills in the gaps in the synoptics, and so he was written later. And the dates that we get here are partly from tradition, but also partly from the understanding of how John's theology and stuff, what sort of development it shows. So John has quite sophisticated theology compared to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so there's, we're in trying to figure that out. We think that it would take a little while for people to come up with those ideas. You can see the development in Paul's letters. And so that's why John is later. And we are quite confident that John lived until the AD 90s. So he could easily have written his gospel at this time. So this is a time frame. This is Jesus' birth in 6 BC, and then his death in that should say AD 33, because you've got to put AD before the thing. I've got it wrong here. And then Mark from 55 here, Luke in the early 60s, Matthew in the mid to late 60s here, and then John at the end. So it's all very, very soon. There's not time for legends and stuff to form here. And there's no, when you read the Gospels, they don't read like legends. So it's only if you believe that miracles are not possible that you want to come up with those sort of explanations. So here's some more data that supports this dating. One is, and these are important ones, the Gospels contain no anachronisms. Anachronisms are things that are out of their time. So if you were reading a book about Victorian England and they mentioned a petrol car, then it's obviously not written during Victorian times because they didn't have petrol cars in Victorian times. So it's a fake Victorian book. The only thing that you might call an anachronism in the Gospels is Jesus' prophecy about the fall of Jerusalem. And some scholars who don't want to believe that God knows the future will say the Gospels must have been written after 70 AD because you can't predict the future that accurately. I don't know about you, but I think God's pretty good at predicting the future. So I have no problems with that. More importantly, and this is a really nasty one for those people who don't want to believe that God can predict the future, is that the Gospels, when you analyze the personal names used in the Gospels and you compare them to the personal names that we know were in use at that time from archaeological evidence, and we do big statistical analysis on it that we can do nowadays that people in the past couldn't do, you discover that the Gospels are incredibly, have a perfect fit with their time. Personal name usage changes a lot over time, and you can tell when something was written, even if it was supposed to be written back in a certain period, it will have the personal name usage of the time that it was actually written, not the time that it was talking about, because people don't have statistical machines to help them get the names right. The only way to get the names right is to actually use the real names and be in that time period so that you're using the right version of the real names, not a changed version, like an updated version. And the Gospels match that perfectly, and there's no way to explain that except to say the Gospels were written in the 1st century. Josephus is another source that gets the names right for the time period, and Josephus was written in the 80s, I think, so in the 1st century, and everyone agrees that Josephus was written then. So the fact that the Gospels agree with Josephus is a really, really strong point to date the Gospels early. Also, there's heaps of references to the Gospel in the writings of the early church fathers, which we have. So the Gospels are attested to very early on and continuously. And we have actual physical copies of the Gospels from the 2nd century. So that's from the 100 years from 100 AD up to 200 AD. So very early in the 2nd century, 110 or something, I think, are early fragments. And in contrast to that, these false Gospels that I mentioned, the earliest copy that we have of any of them, ironically, it's also got a copy of a real Gospel in it. It's got a bit of Matthew in it. That's a manuscript fragment that has bits of the Gospel of Thomas in it, and that's from the late 2nd century to the early 3rd century. So it's almost 100 years later than the real Gospels. So these Gospels that people say should be considered alongside the real Gospels are actually 100 years later. And obviously, if you're writing something 100 years later, you're not able to talk to the people who were there because people don't live that long in this era. So that gives us a lot of confidence in the Gospels. Now we can look at what their content is. And we start with the big picture. What's their structure? Each of the Gospels has their own structure. This is an area where they're quite different. Matthew, as I said, moves stuff around a lot. And as a result, he has this very sophisticated structure, which is this chiasm, this thing where you have wrappers. So you have a beginning and an end associated, and then the second and the second last, the third and the third last. And he goes right down, and in the middle, he has this explanation of Israel's negative response. So, and this reveals one of Matthew's primary concerns is talking about the relationship between the church and Israel, which is why he's quoting from the Old Testament a lot. Another aspect that's fascinating is that Matthew has these sections, which is how we've made the chiasm, of narrative. So that's the story, what's happening, and discourse. Discourse is when Jesus is speaking. So he has this constant narrative, discourse, narrative, discourse, narrative, discourse, narrative, discourse, narrative, discourse, narrative, right through his gospel. Really striking. You've probably never noticed it, but if you go and read Matthew now, you'll probably notice it. So this first part is the infancy narratives and the explanation of Jesus' baptism and John's ministry. And then this first discourse is the Sermon on the Mount. So that gives you a feel for what Matthew's like, if you remember those passages of Matthew. Mark, on the other hand, has a much, much simpler structure. Mark is a very direct book. And so he's got two halves. The Galilean ministry, which starts with Jesus' baptism, bang, straight out of the gate. And it ends with the transfiguration. And that's the fulcrum of Mark's gospel. And then it's the journey to the cross, which ends with the crucifixion and resurrection. And miracles form the sort of the core part of that first part, and teaching is the content of the second part. So Mark's a very simple structure. Luke's structure is tied into the structure of Acts. Luke's structure is to start big. He starts with this declaration of the time. You know, it was the year that the Emperor Augustus called no, it's not
Census.
a census. Yeah, or something like that. And Luke starts with this big picture. And then Jesus, then he talks about Jesus in Galilee, and Jesus comes down to Samaria and Judea, and then to Jerusalem. And then Acts starts in Jerusalem, and then goes out to Samaria, and out to the Gentile world, and ends with the whole world. So Luke has this, the cross on a hill outside Jerusalem is sort of the center, the fulcrum of Luke's two-book structure. So it's sort of reminiscent of Matthew, but in a different way. John, like Mark, is simple on the surface, but John is a lot more complex underneath, sort of reflecting the character of Jesus. Very simple on the surface, very deep underneath. And so John's structure is this simple structure of a prologue, and then, which is all that, you know, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, etc. And then the book of signs, which is talking about Jesus revealing himself through signs, which are miracles. And then there's this interlude when he's I should know what the interlude
Was that
is.
Lazarus?
Yeah, I think it's Lazarus and stuff. And then there's the book of glory, which is the passion when Jesus is going to the cross. And there's finally an appendix after the resurrection. And John also talks about, you know, there's so many more things I could have written, but the whole world would be filled with the books that it would require. So not only does each gospel have a different structure, but they also have a different emphasis. I've taken this from this book, Four Gospels, One Jesus by Richard Burridge. And he really leans into these symbols of the Gospels to help explain them, which is pretty cool. So remember, Mark was a lion, right? And a lion is pacing about, you know, powerful and determined. And for Mark, the time is always now and things are urgent. When you read the Gospel of Mark, it's immediately, and this, and then this, and then this. Jesus is dashing about like a lion. It emphasizes action and conflict, and then discipleship and identity and temple teaching, and then the passion. And it's just all just bang, 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 bang. And it ends in a sudden way as well. It ends with the women coming back from the tomb, wondering what on earth is going on. And I think the disciples, I think it says they don't believe him. And so it ends with us feeling unsettled and confronted. In fact, the whole of Mark is like that. The whole book is just this constant barrage. Matthew, on the other hand, Matthew is the man, remember? And Matthew focuses on Jesus as the God-man, as the man that came, God coming as man. So it has the infancy narratives, which Luke also has. But in Matthew's infancy narratives, he emphasizes Jesus' Jewish human identity. And Matthew sort of presents Jesus as another Moses, who was a man. So Jesus is like an ideal Moses. So Matthew talks about Jesus in the wilderness with his temptation. He talks about Jesus on the mountains, Sermon on the Mount, like Moses, you know, went to Mount Sinai and got the book of the law. And Jesus says in Matthew that he has come to fulfill the law. And so for Matthew, Jesus sort of provides this completion to Moses. Moses is the prototype, Jesus is the fulfillment. So Moses is the type, Jesus is the real thing. And Jesus is a teacher, like Moses, and he's in conflict with Israel, just like Moses was for a lot of the time. But Jesus goes beyond Moses. He suffers, and his suffering redeems God's people. So that's how Matthew works. Luke is the ox, remember, and an ox is a slow-moving, burden-bearing creature. It bears heavy burdens. And so Jesus in Luke is shown as the bearer of burdens. There's an emphasis in Luke, which is really obvious, on the poor, on women, on Gentiles. Luke is really concerned for the downtrodden. And Jesus in Luke is always looking after the downtrodden, like an ox carrying a heavy load. The infancy narratives in Luke take time to locate Jesus in the greater world, because Luke's emphasis on Gentiles is an emphasis on those who don't know God, who are lost. Luke uses geography to tell his story. So Jesus slowly wends his way down to Jerusalem, like we saw in the structure. So Luke uses geography to create this slow movement. And he shows Jesus as orderly, as spiritual, as caring for the weak, even on the cross. And Luke's post-resurrection stories, even his post-resurrection stories, they're down to earth and comfortable. Jesus has a barbie with his mates, you know. He goes for a walk with a couple of his friends and has a great chat, and then they sit down and break bread together on the road to Emmaus. So Luke is a really showing Jesus as a burden-bearing, caring person. But John, in contrast, John is the eagle. So his perspective is sort of this incredible aerial perspective, this high perspective, this soaring perspective on Jesus, especially in the introduction that Graham talked about, seeing Jesus as divine, existing before the beginning of the world. And in John, Jesus speaks in these deep spiritual extended discourses that are not parables. They're not simple down-to-earth parables. They're these deep, complex theological discussions. John doesn't even have many miracles. He just has a few miracles that show Jesus' divinity very clearly. And John's really concerned about Jesus as God. And in contrast to Luke's emphasis on geography, John has an emphasis on time. It's only from John's gospel that we know that Jesus' ministry was 3 years. The other gospels, it seems like it's just 1 year. But in John, we see 3 Passovers. So we know that it was a 3-year ministry. And fully half of John is from Palm Sunday until Jesus' resurrection. So in John, when Jesus comes to the cross, time slows down really radically and stretches out. And of course, John's simplicity that we mentioned in his structure disguises profound depths. And interestingly, John has a simple style of language, simple sentence structure, simple word choice, but he's talking about really profound things. And that's a lot like Jesus. So all of this raises the question, why are there only 4 Gospels? It seems like if there's 4 Gospels, we'd be even better with 8, right? Twice as good, twice as many, twice as good. Well, the reason there's only 4 that we consider the Gospels is because of these ways that the church decided what was an inspired book, what was sent to the church, given to us by God, and what wasn't. I've got these things from this classic text, which every seminary will give you to talk about this. It's called the Canon of Scripture by the Australian scholar F.F. Bruce. And so the categories that people used to decide whether something was really scripture or not were these ones. Apostolic authority. So was this written by an apostle or somebody very, very close to an apostle who was sort of working on behalf of them? So Luke was close to Paul, and Mark was close to Peter, and Matthew and John were apostles. So, yep, they all qualify. Was this a book written close to the time? So is it old? We talked about the dating of the Gospels, and we've got evidence of them in existence from the 2nd century, actual physical evidence. And it's interesting that over the first 3 centuries so that's of the church's existence, and also of what we call the first 3 centuries, there's many, many references to the Gospels, but there's only one reference to one of these other Gospels in the first 3 centuries. So it's not until after 300 years that people start talking about these other Gospels. So they're obviously not old. Are they orthodox? That means, do they agree with the church's beliefs? Remember, I talked about that rule of faith that the disciples passed down from Jesus. And so do they agree with that? Do they agree with the other books that we know are from God? Catholicity. So that means, were they accepted by the whole church, not just a part of the church? And traditional use, that means, were they used by the church traditionally? Have they been used by the church? And inspiration is, were they inspired by God? Generally, if you've answered yes to these first things, then yes, they are inspired by God. But you can also sort of tell sometimes. Certainly, you can tell when something's not inspired by God. And finally, priority. The early Christians were often persecuted, and one of the persecutions was that they had to, if they didn't burn their books, they would be burned themselves or something like that. So it becomes very important that you consider this book something precious. So you have to prioritize the books. So you're not going to be killed. You don't want to be killed for the sake of a book that you don't put much priority on. You know, if Dan Brown's latest novel is, you know, if they're telling you to burn that, you go, yeah, sure, no worries. But if it's a gospel, then maybe not. So that's another way that they could tell whether the books were important or not. What about these other gospels, these extra canonical writings on Jesus? And there were lots of them. These are the sorts of things that were in existence. There were these things called agrapha, which means unwritten. Now, obviously, they didn't stay unwritten because we wouldn't know about them otherwise. But these were not written into the traditional gospels, into the real gospels. So they were teachings of Jesus not recorded in the canonical gospels. And these were transmitted and sometimes made up over time. And they're found in letters from the church fathers and also in some copies of the gospels. In fact, if you look in your Bible, you'll find a couple of agrapha. John chapter 7, verses 53 to 8, verse 11, the story of the woman caught in adultery. That's a story that was added into the Gospel of John after John wrote it. And we can tell that because of the copies of John that we have. And the ending of Mark, there's what's called a new ending and another new ending. And you'll see in your Bible, it tells you that stuff. Those were not in the original copies of Mark as far as we can. So that's an example of agrapha, but they're very reliable agrapha that we sort of accept into our Bible. But there's lots of unreliable ones as well. Then there's the Nag Hammadi library, which was discovered like a century ago or so, and it's a Gnostic library. So Gnosticism is a cult of Christianity. We'll talk about it in a couple of months, and they had these gospels called the Gospel of Thomas, the Apocryphon of James, etc., etc. These were written sometime in the 2nd or 3rd century, and so they're competitors for gospels. Then there were also these infancy gospels that we found copies of, fragments of, the birth of Mary, the infancy story of Thomas. There's fragments of other gospels, the Gospel of Peter, the secret Gospel of Mark. And there's even these, after the Jews, sort of as the church developed, there was a split, which you can see in the New Testament letters, between the Jews who wanted to stay Jewish and the Jews who wanted to be Christian and the Gentiles. And those Jewish Christians, which in the Paul's letters are called Judaizers, those people developed some of their own ideas, and this book, The Ascents of James, it comes out of that sort of community. So why are these things not in the Bible? Well, it's for the same reason that the 4 Gospels are in the Bible, except these books don't qualify. So they're not apostolic. They claim to be from an apostle, but it's very obvious that they're not, because they were written far too late, way after that apostle was dead, or they say things that apostle would never have said, or things like that. They're not antiquated. They're not old. They're not orthodox. Their theology clashes with everything else. They're not accepted by the whole church. They may be accepted by a little cult, but not by the whole church. They're not traditional, so they haven't been used by the church because they're new things. They've just been written. They're not, because of all that, we're pretty sure they're not inspired. And nobody actually wanted to die for these things, so they have a low priority. So here's an example of one of those. Graham, do you want to read this? This is the beginning of the Gospel of Thomas. See if you like it.
These are the hidden words that the living Jesus spoke. And Didymus Judas Thomas wrote them down, and he said, "Whoever finds the meaning of these words will not taste death." Jesus says, "The one who seeks should not cease seeking until he finds, and when he finds, he'll be dismayed. When he's dismayed, he'll be astonished, and he'll be king over all." Jesus says, "If those who lead you say to you, 'Look, the kingdom is in the sky,' then the birds of the sky will precede you. And if they say to you, 'It is in the sea,' then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is inside of you and outside of you."
Makes sense, right? Does that sound like the Gospels? It's pretty different, isn't it? And this is pretty characteristic of the other gospels. They're very, very different, and they're clearly different things from a different sort of belief system. It has some vague relationship to Christianity, but it's not what we understand as Christianity. Certainly, it doesn't seem compatible with Jesus' teaching. So now we can actually get into the content of the Gospels, and we'll whip through this.
So just to double check time, it's
Yep.
almost 25 parts.
Yeah.
We don't need to whip through it. We can continue into next week. If you get to the point you think we should stop at. Your
Okay. Okay. We'll see.
Your fault.
So I won't try to do it too fast.
It's up to you.
So Jesus' ministry in the Gospels, each of the Gospels have these parts to them. They introduce Jesus. Some of them spend more time introducing him than others. Mark, for example, says this is the beginning of the account of Jesus, the Son, the Messiah, the Son of God. That's it. That's Mark's introduction. The other Gospels have a lot more to say. They give an account of his ministry. They give a lot of details of his past week and a lot of details of his death. And then they describe the resurrection and some of the aftermath. And tonight we're just looking at those first two or three, not the death and resurrection. So in the beginning, that's how John's gospel begins. The word existed from eternity and created the world. So that's how John begins. John was miraculously conceived by barren parents. This is John the Baptist. So, by the way, up here I've got Luke, Matthew, and John. Mark doesn't really say much about the beginnings. It just jumps straight in at Jesus' baptism. So this material is just Luke, Matthew, and John, primarily Luke, with a lot of Matthew and a little bit of John. So John was miraculously conceived by barren parents. Jesus was conceived by the Holy Spirit and the Virgin Mary. John was born. Jesus was born 6 months later. The shepherds visited the family of Jesus, prompted by the angels on the night that he was born. Jesus was consecrated and circumcised 8 days after he was born and prophesied over. Then sometime later, the Magi visited Jesus. Jesus' family fled to Egypt because Herod wanted to kill Jesus and killed all of the boys in Bethlehem, 2 years old and younger. Then a few years later, Jesus' family returned to Nazareth. Jesus' family celebrated the Passover when Jesus was about 12. And we also have genealogies of Jesus. Matthew presents a genealogy that runs from Abraham to Jesus, and Luke presents a genealogy that runs in reverse order from Jesus to Adam. These two genealogies are different between David and Jesus, just so you know. And the theory to explain that is that one of them is presenting Mary's genealogy and the other is presenting Joseph's. Jesus wasn't biologically Joseph's son, obviously. He was biologically God's son, but he was biologically Mary's son. So that's the reasoning for that. Then we hear about John the Baptist's ministry. John appears from the wilderness, and then he's dressed in a hair cloak and a leather belt, just like Elijah. Exactly the same description as for Elijah from Kings. He's eating only what can be foraged in the wilderness, honey and wild locusts, so he's a very humble man. But his preaching attracts many followers and listeners, including rich people and Pharisees and stuff. And John confronts these people, even Roman soldiers, over their sins. And he baptizes many of them for their sins. And then Jesus comes along and John baptizes Jesus. This is where Mark starts. And the Gospels tell us that John found it strange to baptize Jesus because Jesus didn't need to repent from his sins, but Jesus told him to do it anyway. And God affirms Jesus as his beloved Son, and the Spirit descends on Jesus. And that's actually what Jesus was baptized for. He was baptized to identify himself with us and to fulfill the law for us, so that when we take on his righteousness, we've fulfilled the law through Jesus. And so Jesus did this for us, and we too share in God's affirmation and the Holy Spirit's coming to dwell in us when we accept Jesus as well. So it's for our sakes that happened. Then Jesus goes off into the wilderness like Moses for 40 days, not for 40 years, and he's tempted by Satan, and he resists the temptations. And the temptations are sort of representative of the temptations that we all face as human beings. And Jesus resists them all. And it shows it's the 40 days is a recurring theme. Moses 40 years in the wilderness, Israel's 40 years in the wilderness, and David's time in the wilderness before he became king, and also Judea's exile in Babylon. So these things all taught people humility and faithfulness. And Jesus goes through the same thing again, fulfilling these things for us. Then Jesus calls the disciples. It takes a while. It doesn't all happen at once. He calls them from amongst fishermen, including some of the disciples of John the Baptist. He calls them from a tax collector's booth. That's Matthew. From zealotry, that's Simon the Zealot. And two of the disciples are actually introduced to Jesus by the ex-disciples of John. So Simon Peter is introduced by his brother Andrew, who was a disciple of John, and Nathanael is introduced by Philip, who was a disciple of John. And then Jesus has got this huge bunch of disciples. We don't know how many, but it's a lot, and he chooses 12 disciples out of them to focus on. And we know there are a lot of disciples that follow Jesus around because after his death, after his resurrection rather, Paul talks about there being 500 people who saw him after he'd risen from the dead, and they're people that knew him before. So we've got 6 slides to go.
Tough, Pastor. It's up to you. I reckon we can continue next week because this is really, really good stuff.
Yeah.
And if we rush it, we miss it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll stop there at the calling of the disciples, and next week we'll continue from Jesus' teachings and go through beyond there. So, do people actually? I'll jump forward to the some of the conclusions that we can draw, because I think it's important to keep track of what we're doing this for. So the Gospels, as we've seen, they're powerful testimonies to Jesus' ministry, right? They're reliable, they're ancient, they're really they're factual. We've got 4, which gives us this 3-dimensional view. It's almost like a CT scan, right? It's coming from all these different angles. So we've got this 3-dimensional picture of Jesus, which allows us to virtually enter into his presence and just be with him and learn about him and come to know him. And it shows Jesus' concerns and the sort of person he was and how he taught. All 4 of these Gospels are totally reliable, and we don't have to worry about doubting them. Even the material that we have, even before we get to Jesus' death and resurrection, the things that Jesus did, the things he said, are sufficient to turn the world upside down, not just our world, but the whole world. And so I've concluded that regular reading of and meditation on each of these Gospels, all four of them, is a fruitful exercise and something that as Christians we should make a part of our faith practice. And we do have lots of great materials that we can use. The Bible Project has excellent videos on each of the Gospels from their New Testament overviews. They've also got a whole series on the Sermon on the Mount and a series on Luke Acts. Then, of course, you can watch The Chosen. That's got a lot of speculation in it, but it's fantastic stuff, giving a real feel of what it might have been like in Jesus' time to be one of the disciples. There's this book here that I've just drawn from, which has a lot of references to C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and stuff, and really brings alive the way that the Gospels work. And if you're really, really into this, there's courses that you can do. This particular one, 4 Portraits, 1 Jesus, there's a free video on the webpage, which this link goes to, which is worth watching. It's about 20 minutes long, and he gives a really good introduction, which sort of touches on a lot of the stuff that I've talked about. But if you want a full-on, maybe slightly dry, but full-on course, something like this course from Darrell Bock is really good. But I'm warning you, you'll need lots of cups of coffee. So, or do it in the morning. Okay, so questions, responses.